Walter and Reimar Horten had an interest from the early 1930s in unorthodox aircraft designs and flying wings in particular. From the mid-30s into the early 40s, they designed and built several successive flying wing glider designs that showed promise but had limited military potential. Well, once jet engines became slightly more accessible, they submitted a proposal for a jet-powered flying wing design to meet one of the many requests by the German leadership for high-speed bombers. They hoped that the reduced drag of a flying wing might compensate for the high fuel consumption of early jet engines in order to provide good range and speed at the same time, which is something other aircraft just couldn't really deliver. Their plane was designated Ho-229, and production was approved in 1943 with an order for 100 planes. Well, as happened very often under poorly mustachioed fascism, scope creep hit the 229 hard, and there was a new requirement to fit the plane out with cannons so that it could serve as an interceptor, in addition to the small bomb load. After it was clear that this was going to cause delays, the order was cut back to just a few dozen planes with only the cannons, and then the political infighting began about which company and factory would actually build the thing, as the Horten's workshop wasn't really set up for mass production. The actual aircraft was incredibly advanced for its time, with its swept-wing flying wing design, engines deep in the fuselage, an ejection seat, and of course, the jet engines themselves. The first prototype was a glider, but the second prototype flew under jet power on February 2, 1945. Later in the test program, a crash that followed an engine failure destroyed the prototype and killed the test pilot, but the project was seen as just too important for delays, and the work continued on the third prototype. There are conflicting reports in different sources if the V3 prototype ever actually flew, but regardless, it was captured by the Allies in April of 1945 and shipped off to the United States for evaluation. The only surviving airframe is currently under restoration at the American National Air and Space Museum. Lastly, I want to take a moment to clear up a common point of misunderstood trivia that floats around the internet these days. Going into more detail about this point would add like 15 or 20 minutes to the video, but in short, the Ho-229 was never intended to be any kind of stealth fighter. It's true that the design had a slightly lower radar signature than propeller-driven aircraft, but there is no evidence that this was an intentional design consideration, and the reduction in radar cross-section wasn't really enough to make much of a difference anyway. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the Ho-229 V3, representing that third prototype I just mentioned. This is a jet fighter in rank 5 of the German tech tree at battle rating 7.0. This plane's only armament is a pair of Mk-103 30mm cannons with 170 rounds per gun. The good news is that you get some great ammo selections, with the Armored Targets belt including some AP rounds that can punch through medium armor, and the Air Targets belt getting some great Minengeschoss rounds that can take out a fighter in just one hit, or set a bomber on fire in, again, just one hit. The flight performance on the Horten is, unsurprisingly, completely unique, as this is the only flying wing aircraft currently in the game. Now, a few basic things up front. The engines on this jet don't really provide a whole lot of thrust, and like most other World War II era jet planes, the acceleration is cripplingly slow. However, it's got a low drag design, so in level flight it keeps its energy pretty easily, and it speeds up fast in a dive, to the point where that can be a problem, as the controls lock up badly if you swoop in too quick. It's got an air brake, which helps, but you still need to mind your airspeed more than usual if you're diving in from above. The flying wing design also provides significant lift, which has a few side effects. This jet has an incredibly low stall speed, and you can keep it in the air and controllable, kind of, as low as about 175 kilometers an hour. It also climbs well once you get over about 450 or so, even without needing much vertical pitch. This jet also has absolute UFO performance on the lateral axis. But there are some trade-offs. You can flip the attitude of this plane around very quickly, but it's got some of the worst energy retention in the game if you abuse its pitch authority. You can pull an incredibly tight high G loop to get behind someone very quickly, but it's not uncommon for maneuvers like that to cost you half your airspeed in just 3 or 4 seconds. You're also going to be blacking out constantly if you pull that stuff, as you can see in some of the clips I used, and all of this footage was recorded with a fully maxed Ace pilot. This brings us to the other big issue. Quite obviously, this jet has no rudder. It controls its yaw by using differential spoilers out near the wingtips. This is a very weak yaw force, and while it's fine to keep the plane flying straight and prevent it from wobbling around, it doesn't help much when you're trying to make fine adjustments in a turn. If you're one of those viewers who watches my vids to learn the weaknesses of the planes I cover, pay attention because this is the big one. If you're trying to do a deflection shot on a target in a turn, even the slightest change in direction from your target on its vertical yaw axis can completely throw off your aim and ruin the shot, since your yaw correction is several seconds behind them. Add to this that the jet has a really poor rate of roll, and it adds up to some difficult gunnery. This jet absolutely does have crazy UFO maneuverability, but it's very one-dimensional maneuverability. Taking this plane into air battles can be similar to other World War II era jets in that you generally want to side climb for altitude while building up speed. The Horten tends to work best as a boom and zoom fighter, going for targets that aren't really maneuvering too hard, and using its own maneuverability more defensively than offensively. I won't sugarcoat it, the plane really is quite difficult to use effectively, but don't get discouraged if you have a bad initial experience. You can get kills and have a lot of fun, it just takes practice because of how unique and strange this plane's flying is. It's also worth mentioning that the guns have a good ballistics trajectory but a low rate of fire. You can make somewhat accurate long-distance shots if you're careful, but targets can fly in between your shots in a turn if you're not perfectly synced up. Kind of a trade-off. In terms of ground attack, don't bother in air battles, but over a ground battle, the Armored Targets belt can actually take out light and medium tanks if you get a good firing angle. The Horten ends up being surprisingly effective as a tank buster. Visually, I think the Ho-229 is a beautiful aircraft. The 3D model is very well done, the default paint job looks great, and the fancy invasion skin is pretty badass. I didn't use it in the vid, but there's also an unlockable camouflage paint job if that's more of your style. Landing this plane is something you're going to want to practice at least a couple of times. The big secret is that you want to set down super slow and pitched up. Now, it's not uncommon to float 2 or 3 meters over the runway with this thing, or ride the nose wheel after touching down, which can drag the landing run out quite a bit. The brakes aren't the best, so you want to make sure that all 3 wheels are firmly on the ground as quickly as possible. The cockpit on this jet has fairly good visibility and clear instruments. The gun sight is a little obstructive in a turn fight, but overall I still had a really good time with this in VR. Strongly recommended. To close out on the Horten 229 V3. This jet has powerful guns with strong ammo belts and absolutely insane authority on the lateral axis. However, it doesn't roll well, it doesn't yaw well, it's a bit underpowered, even light damage can send this thing out of control, and overall it's not beginner friendly. The final verdict on the 229 is that this plane has a completely unique flight model and playstyle, which can be difficult to master. It can be effective, but just know in advance that it's going to take a lot of practice, and even then, there isn't really much you can do to mitigate the plane's shortcomings. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.